The mahogany doors of David Reynolds' study felt unusually heavy as Angela Smith pushed them open. Her hands trembled slightly, but her posture remained straight, dignified. The afternoon sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating David's silhouette as he stood behind his massive desk. "Mr. Reynolds, I need to tell you something," Angela said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She'd rehearsed this moment countless times over the past week, but standing here now, the words felt thick in her throat. David barely looked up from his laptop, his fingers continuing to type. "Make it quick, Angela. I have a board meeting in 20 minutes. His dismissive tone was nothing new. She'd worked as his housekeeper for 3 years and had grown accustomed to his brusque manner. "I'm pregnant," she stated plainly. The typing stopped. David's head snapped up, his blue eyes finally meeting hers. The color drained from his face as the implications of her words sank in. The night of the company Christmas party 2 months ago hung between them, unspoken but impossible to ignore. "That's impossible," he said automatically, though they both knew it wasn't. "We used." His voice trailed off as he remembered they hadn't. Angela remained silent, letting the truth settle in the room. Outside, a gardener's lawn mower droned on, creating an oddly mundane soundtrack to this life-changing moment. David stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward and hitting the wall. He began pacing, his perfectly polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. "You can't keep it," he said finally, his voice low and controlled. "I'm keeping my baby," Angela replied, emphasizing the word "my." "I'm not here to make demands, Mr. Reynolds. I simply thought you should know." David's face hardened. He reached for his phone, pressed a button. "Janet, bring me the termination paperwork." His voice was cold, businesslike. Angela's eyes widened. "You're firing me? This is a liability I can't afford. You'll receive 6 months severance pay, contingent upon your silence about this matter." He wouldn't look at her now, focusing instead on straightening items on his desk that didn't need straightening. Janet arrived with the paperwork moments later, her eyes curious but professional. David signed the forms without hesitation, then slid them across the desk to Angela. As Angela packed her belongings, tears finally broke through her composed facade. She folded her uniforms carefully, each one a reminder of the stability she was losing. Photos of her family came off her small bulletin board, her mother in Jamaica, her sisters in London. They didn't know yet. Nobody knew. Later that evening, David attended the Metropolitan Museum's annual gala. He stood among New York's elite, champagne flute in hand, forcing smiles and making small talk about stock prices and real estate investments. But every time someone mentioned family or legacy, he felt a tightness in his chest. "When are you going to settle down, David?" Harrison Montgomery III asked, clapping him on the back. "Can't let the Reynolds empire end with you, old sport." David laughed mechanically, took another sip of champagne. Across the room, he caught his reflection in a mirror, successful, powerful, respected. But for the first time in his life, he didn't recognize the men staring back at him. The evening wore on, a blur of faces and forced conversations. Each time the ballroom doors opened, he half expected to see Angela walking in, ready to expose him. But she didn't come. He knew she wouldn't. Her dignity wouldn't allow it. As his driver took him home that night, David watched the city lights blur past his window. He had protected his reputation, his business, his carefully constructed world. But as his mansion came into view, empty and dark, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. 50 years passed like a slow-moving glacier, carving deep valleys of regret into David Reynolds' life. His mansion, once a symbol of achievement, had become his fortress of solitude. Awards lined the walls of his study: Business Leader of the Decade, Humanitarian of the Year, Lifetime Achievement, each one a hollow reminder of what success had cost him. David sat in his leather chair, now worn from decades of use, staring at the financial news on his tablet without really seeing it. At 82, he had survived 3 market crashes, 2 heart attacks, and countless business rivals. But loneliness was proving to be his most formidable opponent. The housekeepers, he'd gone through dozens since Angela, knew to leave him alone in the mornings. They worked silently, efficiently, their presence a ghost-like reminder of a past he couldn't forget. Across town, in a modest apartment in Brooklyn, Malik Smith opened another cardboard box labeled "Mom's Things." Angela had passed away 3 months ago, but he'd only now found the strength to sort through her belongings. Each item told a story: her nursing degree, earned through night classes, photographs of school plays she'd never missed despite working double shifts, newspaper clippings of her community organizing efforts. Then he found it, a worn leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. The first entry was dated 50 years ago, written in his mother's neat, determined handwriting. "Today, I lost my job, but I gained something far more precious. I'm going to be a mother. Mr. Reynolds may have shown me the door, but he has no idea how strong I am. This child will have everything I can give them, even if I have to work until my hands bleed." Malik's hands trembled as he turned the pages. Each entry revealed another layer of his mother's life, her struggles, her triumphs, her unwavering determination. She wrote about working multiple jobs while pregnant, about the kind neighbor who taught her to knit baby clothes, about the community college professors who let her bring infant Malik to class. But it was the entry from his 5th birthday that made his heart stop. "Today, I saw David Reynolds on television, accepting another award. Malik asked why I was crying. How do I tell my beautiful boy that his father is one of the most powerful men in the country? That the same man who sends millions to charity couldn't spare a moment for his own son? No. Better he knows only my love than half of his heritage." Malik set the journal down, his mind racing. The name David Reynolds was familiar. Everyone knew Reynolds Industries, the technology empire that had shaped the modern world. He'd studied Reynolds' business strategies in college, written papers about the company's innovation in sustainable energy. But this was impossible. He opened his laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. Article after article about David Reynolds filled his screen. The resemblance was subtle but undeniable. They had the same sharp jawline, the same way of furrowing their brow in photographs. How had he never noticed before? Recent photos showed an aged Reynolds, still commanding respect but clearly withdrawn from public life. The latest headline read, "Reynolds Industries CEO becomes recluse, hasn't left estate in 6 months." Malik closed the laptop and walked to his window, looking out at the Brooklyn skyline. Beyond those buildings, in a mansion in Manhattan, sat a man who had shaped his life through absence. A man who had forced his mother to be both parents, who had missed every birthday, every graduation, every moment that mattered. The journal lay open on his coffee table, his mother's words calling out through time. "Sometimes I wonder if I should tell him. If David deserves to know what an amazing person his son has become. But then I remember that morning in his study, how easily he discarded us, and I know, some bridges can't be rebuilt. But bridges, Malik thought, could be crossed anyway." He picked up his phone and opened his email. The cursor blinked in the empty Compose window as he considered his next move. After 50 years, it was time for David Reynolds to meet his son. Malik spent 2 weeks meticulously researching David Reynolds before making his move. His dining room table disappeared under printouts of articles, financial reports, and photographs spanning 5 decades. Each document revealed another facet of the man who had abandoned him and his mother. Reynolds Industries' annual reports painted a picture of relentless ambition. The company had started in technology manufacturing, then expanded into renewable energy, biotechnology, and artificial intelligence. David Reynolds had transformed a $1 million inheritance into a $1 billion empire. But nowhere in the countless profiles and interviews did anyone mention a personal life beyond surface-level philanthropy. "Your father builds walls," Angela had once told him. Not just around his house, but around his heart. Now, studying security photos of the Reynolds estate, Malik understood what she meant. The mansion's gates had grown higher over the years, the security system more sophisticated. David Reynolds wasn't just protecting his wealth, he was hiding from something. Meanwhile, across the city, David sat in a board meeting, his attention drifting from the quarterly projections on the screen. A junior executive was droning on about market penetration when something caught David's eye. A personnel file had been left open on his tablet. The employee photo showed a young woman with Angela's determined expression, and for a moment, he was back in that study 50 years ago. "Mr. Reynolds." The executive's voice snapped him back to reality. "Should we proceed with the Asian expansion?" David realized every face at the table was turned toward him, waiting. He'd built this company on split-second decisions, but lately, every choice felt weighted with unspoken consequences. "Continue as planned," he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command. but his hand trembled slightly as he closed the personnel file. The meeting ended, and David remained alone in the conference room. Outside his window, Manhattan stretched like a concrete maze, hiding countless stories like his own. How many other lives had he affected without knowing? How many decisions had rippled out beyond his control? His phone buzzed, an email notification. The subject line read, "Regarding Angela Smith." David's heart stopped. He opened it with fingers that suddenly felt too old, too stiff. "Mr. Reynolds, my name is Malik Smith. I believe we need to talk about events that occurred 50 years ago. I'll be at your office tomorrow at 2 p.m. Regards, Malik Smith." Short. Direct. No room for evasion. David recognized the tone. It was how he wrote his own emails. The next day, Malik walked into Reynolds Industries headquarters wearing his best suit. The lobby's marble floors reflected his image back at him, tall, confident, successful in his own right. Security had been expecting him. "Mr. Reynolds will see you now," the guard said, leading him to a private elevator. David stood as Malik entered his office. For a moment, neither man spoke. They studied each other across 50 years of absence. David saw Angela's determination in Malik's stance, but the set of his jaw, the way he held himself, that was pure Reynolds. "You look like her," David said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. "I have your eyes," Malik replied. The words landed like stones in still water. David sank back into his chair. "How long have you known?" 3 weeks. I found Mom's journal after she died." Malik remained standing, unwilling to cede even this small advantage. "She never told me about you. Never asked you for anything. She worked 3 jobs to put me through school. Did you know that?" David's face paled. "Angela passed away." "Don't pretend to care now," Malik's voice cut through the air. "You had 50 years to care. 50 years to ask questions. To wonder about her. About me." "I did wonder," David whispered. "Every day. Wondering isn't enough." Malik's composure cracked. "You were building an empire while she was building a life for us. A real life, with love and sacrifice and..." He stopped, collecting himself. "I didn't come here for explanations or apologies. I came here because you should know that despite your best efforts to erase us, we existed. We thrived. And now you have to live with that knowledge just like we lived with your absence." David stood again, gripping his desk for support. "Malik, please." But Malik was already turning to leave. At the door, he paused. "Mom used to say that wealth doesn't make a man rich. Now I understand what she meant." The door closed behind him, leaving David alone with 50 years of unspoken words. 2 days after their first meeting, David couldn't sleep. His vast bedroom felt like a prison cell, every luxury a mockery of his failures. At 3 a.m., he did something he hadn't done in decades. He opened the hidden safe behind his bedroom's master painting. Inside lay a single envelope, yellowed with age, containing the termination papers he'd given Angela that day. His hands shook as he dialed Malik's number, found through his company's resources. To his surprise, Malik answered on the 3rd ring. "I need to tell you everything," David said, his voice rough with insomnia. "Not for forgiveness. For truth." There was a long pause before Malik responded. "Tomorrow. Neutral ground. The coffee shop on 8th and Broadway, 10 a.m. The coffee shop was nearly empty when they met. David arrived first, looking smaller somehow in casual clothes instead of his usual tailored suits. Malik arrived precisely on time, ordered nothing, and sat down across from the men who'd shaped his life through absence. "I was 32 when your mother told me she was pregnant," David began, staring into his untouched coffee. "I had just taken over the company from my father. The board was looking for any excuse to prove I wasn't ready." He paused, remembering. "But that's not why I did it. Those are excuses, and you deserve better than excuses." Malik remained silent, his face unreadable. "I did it because I was afraid," David continued. "Not of scandal or the board or losing money. I was afraid of becoming my father." His hands tightened around his coffee cup. Howard Reynolds was a brilliant businessman and a terrible father. He made sure I understood that love was weakness, that family was a liability. When Angela told me about you, all I could hear was his voice telling me I would fail you both. So you failed us first, Malik said, his voice cold. Got it over with quickly. Yes. David's admission hung in the air between them. I convinced myself it was better to stay away completely than to be the kind of father I'd had. I told myself Angela would find someone better, that you'd have a real family. He laughed bitterly. I didn't know she was strong enough to be both parents. I didn't know you'd become successful without a single advantage I could have given you. Mom made sure I understood the difference between advantages and privileges, Malik said. She taught me that respect is earned, not bought. David nodded slowly. She was right. But there's something else you should know. He hesitated, then forced himself to continue. The day I fired her, she wasn't the only one who knew about the pregnancy. My father's old board member, Richard Harrison, overheard our conversation. He came to me afterward with the termination papers already drawn up. Malik's expression changed slightly. You're saying you were pressured? No. David's response was immediate. I'm saying I was a coward who let others make my choices because it was easier than standing up for what was right. The board, Richard, my father's ghost, they all influenced me, but the choice was mine. I signed those papers. I let you both go. Malik stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I need time to process this. Of course, David said, still not looking up. But Malik, your mother should have told me what an extraordinary person you became. That's not a criticism of her choice. It's an acknowledgement of my loss. Malik paused at the door. Mom used to say that some people create their own prisons. I never understood what she meant until now. He left without looking back. David remained at the table long after Malik had gone, watching his coffee grow cold. Across the street, a young father was teaching his daughter to ride a bike, holding the seat as she wobbled forward, his face full of pride and concern. David watched until they disappeared around the corner, then slowly made his way back to his empty mansion. That night, he took out his phone and scrolled through news articles about Malik's achievements, his academic honors, his community work, his business success. Each accomplishment felt like a door closing, a moment he could never reclaim. He fell asleep in his study, surrounded by evidence of everything he'd missed. Angela Smith stepped onto the stage of the Women's Leadership Conference, her silver hair gleaming under the spotlights. At 75, she carried herself with the same dignity that had sustained her through decades of struggle. The audience of 300 fell silent as she approached the podium. Success isn't measured by the height you reach, she began, but by the depth of the holes you climb out of. Her voice, still strong despite her years, carried to every corner of the room. In the back row, Malik sat unnoticed, watching his mother command the stage. He'd attended dozens of her speeches over the years, but this one felt different. The weight of David's confession sat heavy in his chest, changing the context of every word she spoke. Angela continued her speech, sharing her journey from single mother to community organizer to renowned activist. She never mentioned David Reynolds by name, but her pointed references to privileged men who mistake wealth for worth made several audience members shift uncomfortably. After the speech, Malik waited in the green room. When Angela entered, she stopped short, her practiced smile faltering. You've read it, haven't you? She asked, knowing immediately why he was there. A mother always knows. The journal? Yes. Malik helped her to a chair. Why didn't you tell me? Angela took a moment to arrange her thoughts, smoothing her blazer with hands that had scrubbed floors and changed diapers and later signed legislation. At first, it was anger. I wanted to prove we didn't need him. Then, as you grew, it became protection. You were thriving, becoming your own person. Why burden you with his shadow? I met him, Malik said quietly. He told me about the day he fired you. About the board member who overheard. Angela's laugh was sharp. Richard Harrison. That man represented everything wrong with their world. He came to me afterward, you know. Offered me money to handle the situation. I told him I'd rather clean toilets than take his blood money. Her eyes flashed with old anger. And I did clean toilets, among other things. But every dollar I earned was clean. Mom. Malik began, but Angela raised her hand. Let me finish. David was weak, yes. But the system that gave him the power to discard us so easily, that's what I've spent my life fighting against. Every scholarship program I've established, every policy I've helped change, every single mother I've mentored, it all started with that day in his study. Malik leaned forward. He seems different now. Regretful. Regret is a luxury of the wealthy, Angela said firmly. The rest of us just live with our choices. She reached for her purse and pulled out a small photo album. But maybe it's time you saw these. The album contained photos Malik had never seen before. Angela, young and beautiful in her housekeeper's uniform, standing in front of the Reynolds mansion. Another of her with a group of staff members at what looked like a Christmas party. And one, stuck in the back, of a much younger David Reynolds actually smiling as Angela served him tea. There was kindness in him once, Angela said softly. Before fear and privilege corrupted it. That's why I allowed myself to. She trailed off, closing the album. Well, the past is the past. Is it? Malik asked. Because right now, it feels very present. Angela stood, straightening her jacket. The question isn't whether David Reynolds deserves forgiveness. The question is whether knowing him will add value to your life. I made my choice 50 years ago. Now you get to make yours. She hugged him then, and Malik noticed for the first time how small she'd become, how fragile her shoulders felt under his arms. Yet her spine remained straight, her dignity intact. Whatever you decide, she whispered, remember that you are not defined by his actions or my choices. You're defined by your own. As they left the conference center together, reporters called out to Angela, asking for comments on her latest advocacy project. She handled them with practiced ease, but Malik noticed she kept her hand on his arm, as if drawing strength from his presence. In the taxi home, Angela finally asked the question that had been weighing on her. Are you angry with me? For keeping this from you? Malik considered his answer carefully. I'm angry at the situation. At the world that made those choices seem necessary. But never at you, Mom. Never at you. The taxi rolled through streets that had witnessed their struggle, past buildings where Angela had cleaned offices at night while Malik slept in the break room. Every block held a memory of sacrifice and survival. You know, Angela said as they neared home, sometimes the strongest thing you can do is forgive. Not for them, but for yourself. Malik nodded, understanding that she wasn't just talking about David anymore. David stood at his office window, watching a news segment about Angela Smith's latest speech play on mute. The years had been kind to her, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had won her battles fairly. The caption identified her as leading social justice advocate, community rights pioneer. Turn it up, he told his assistant through the intercom. Angela's voice filled the room. We're announcing the formation of the New Beginnings Foundation, she was saying. Dedicated to supporting single parents in pursuing their education and career goals. No one should have to choose between their children.